From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. From the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock is featured on this week's cattle market segment. She'll discuss the multiple packing plant closures forced by the COVID-19 situation and the ability of the cattle industry to see this disruption through. Also from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State, Gregg Hanzlicek cautions you cattle producers about the possibility of blue-green algae turning up in farm ponds this early and presenting a toxicity threat to cattle. Such a case has already been confirmed in Kansas. And later, Jeff Wickman with this week's 4-H segment. K-State's Beth Hinshaw salutes 4-H volunteers. All that right here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, Amber Alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Thanks once more for tuning in for this Agriculture Today. On the cattle markets, first of all here, and going down the internet line to Katelyn McCullock, the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Of course, to remind you, a service co-sponsored by K-State and numerous other land-grant universities. Well, so much to talk about, Katelyn, so many things to sort through that are atypical, stemming from the coronavirus situation. Let's begin, though, by looking back at last week's cash-fed cattle trade. Rather uneven was that trade. Is that a fair descriptive?
I would agree with that statement. It was a little uneven, although I've been impressed that we ended the week holding a dollar per pound for live steers across the 5 area. I think with the changes to the slaughter plant capacity, I would expect these prices to bounce around a little bit till we get more certainty in the capacity situation and how many cattle we are going to be able to slaughter any given week. As I'm sure many of your listeners have heard, closures have been rolling out every week. We've heard new information, whether it's suspending operations, slowing chain speeds, doing maintenance, closing indefinitely. All of those affect our capacity situation and change how many cattle we can slaughter a week. So in the feedlots right now, we have plenty of cattle, and the packers are at a point where they're trying to address the health and safety concerns at their individual plants and do the best they can with that situation.
It's a hard question, but at what point do we see really serious ramifications of these beef plant closures in the cattle sector? There's some, obviously, as you say, some effect already, but is there more negative to come, so to speak?
There could be. I think it depends on how many plants you have closed at the same time and the ability to shift around that slaughter depending on what region you're in. We look at this last week was estimated beef slaughter to be down 28% below a year ago. That's a pretty significant drop, and I would expect fed cattle prices could move lower based on that. But a lot of the adjustment you can see week by week has depended on how many cattle are in the market. You know, when buyers are coming, it depends on when that delivery point is and what their schedule looks like. And unfortunately, all those things are still relatively uncertain. If you're trying to buy cattle 2 weeks from now, we've seen how quickly things can change if all of a sudden your plant has an extreme amount of cases that force closures or force absenteeism in the plant. That can still really affect those markets. And so I think there's a great deal of uncertainty, and there could potentially be some further price implications. Now, coronavirus positive cases are still rolling through the Midwest. And until we get through some of those peak numbers known and regionally, we deal with all of these health situations, we're still in for probably some volatile prices and the potential for further price decline, unfortunately, in the fed cattle industry.
And the challenge, Katelyn, before our cattle feeders to stay relatively current, that's going to be more and more difficult with each passing week. So how do you see this affecting that ability of the industry to remain something resembling current?
I think cattle feeders are probably going to back up cattle to some extent. We've moved our average weights up based on our forecast to represent that situation. The last 2 months, February and March, showed some aggressive marketing on the cattle feeding side, possibly in part because of some solid hedging risk management strategies that were put in place when those cattle entered the feedlot. But also, I think there was a little bit of trying to get ahead of this, although probably you weren't able to put yourself in what you would consider a great position. What we're seeing in the latest cattle on feed report, we still saw aggressive marketings. They were up 13%, but our placement number was well below a year ago. And that really represents the numbers that we're seeing on the futures board, the uncertainty around what beef demand and fed cattle demand from the packers will be moving forward. And there's really not a lot of risk management opportunities where you can hedge to the point of making a profit on the animals that are going to be placed today. And that's very reflective of the last two cattle on feed reports. March showed placements were down 23% below a year ago. That's the smallest number we've seen since 1996. And 1996 was the first year this monthly cattle on feed report started to be released. So we're going all the way back in the history books. We're not seeing numbers this small. And so it's a pretty big change. But what that means is when these cattle would come out, you're not going to have the supplies that you would have, quote unquote, normally seen. And so I think we're going to have a lot of heavier placements coming out of this summer when you look at those cattle on feed reports based on what we're hearing from producers.
You covered the cattle on feed report there, released this past Friday. Earlier this past week, the USDA also put out a cold storage report. You deemed that to have interesting numbers, Katelyn. You might elaborate on that.
I would say interesting in the sense is that we're trying to figure out how much the consumer is eating through these large production numbers in the retail outlets and how much the food service sector, we're missing out on that consumption. So what gets left over is going to end up in cold storage. Beef inventories gained more ground in terms of they added more pounds into those cold storage inventories. They were up more than 11% compared to last year. The big increase was seen in bone-in cuts. Those were up 20%, and boneless beef was up 10%. Now, beef wasn't immune. Almost all the meat categories increased over a year ago. Pork was about 2.2% ahead of a year ago. One of the big stories there is that bellies are up 34% compared to a year ago. And a lot of that's the inability to move as much bacon as you would have consumed in food service through that retail channel. Some of this gets back to consumer behavior. I mean, you might be home every day in isolation, but how often are you cooking bacon compared to how often you're willing to just add it to your burger or add it to whatever dish you're eating? It's a much easier principle, I think, to have someone else cook it and add it a couple of portions at a time. Chicken inventories increased considerably, which at least at my grocery stores at home, chicken was selling really well through retail channels, particularly breast meat, which had a pretty bad year last year. Total chicken was 14.2% above last year, listed in cold storage at the end of March, and breast meat climbed 27% over 2019. So even though it seems like we're distributing quite a bit through those retail channels, it still seems like we have quite a bit of chicken on hand, that the very strong buying in March did not offset that.
As we look for the proverbial bright spot in these markets, one could point to, Katelyn, the boxed beef trade.
Choice boxed beef has had another good week last week. It has climbed more than $50 Monday to Friday. And Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of last week each hit a new daily record high for the choice boxed beef. Now, Select have also done well, and the spread's about $14 between the two.
And what do you read from that then? Obviously, the demand side, there is promise there to some degree.
I think some of it is the squeeze on the packing side, but you've seen strength in the rib primal values. That was over $350 by Thursday and Friday of last week. Chuck and rounds are being well supported right now. Some of that's going back into ground product. It looks like this week we've had almost all the primals climb throughout the week. And I would attribute some of that to that capacity issue that we've been talking about.
You consider all of those numbers, but there again, the abnormal times we're in, will we see shifting sands as far as consumption patterns moving forward if parts of the country, for instance, open up their economies, their activities? There are so many unknowns here, Katelyn, looking forward.
It's a difficult thing to predict because on the one hand, the changes in slaughter capacity, you have a tightening in that situation. So you have, quote unquote, too many fed cattle moving through that system for what the slaughter plants can handle at this time. On the other side, you have constriction in that wholesale market. And so you're going to have stronger wholesale prices. That could mean certain meat cuts are stronger than others, depending on where consumers are shifting to. But it could be, too, logistical challenges and how those products are packaged or fabricated that need to have changes made based on labor allocations in the plant. It's really unknown, too, where those price points start to kick in for this consumer, where you have a lot more unemployment. Every week, that unemployment number continues to climb. And even though federal stimulus is supporting those individuals, I have to believe that they're making changes based on the uncertainty and general sentiment about the economy and where they're at, the virus, et cetera. Now, even though we've been talking about the economy opening, I think there's going to be a period of time, a window where folks might be allowed to go to places they haven't been, but they might also not rush into those establishments. I know at my house, I'm ready to eat out again and have someone else cook for me. But I think maybe there'll still just be not a lot of optimism around health and safety. I think when it comes down to it, there's going to be a section of the population that say, hey, I've been cooking at home for 2 months. I can cook 1 more week, 2 more weeks, et cetera. And we've seen this in some of the other markets that have opened up, just maybe a little reluctance to rush out and participate in those sectors. And so I think it could be a rather slow warm up, even if those restaurants and food service outlets are open again.
The challenges continue. And Katelyn, good input on all of this. Many thanks to you. Take care out Denver way.
Thank you.
Katelyn McCullock is the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center. And with those remarks on the cattle trading trends on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and now for you cattle producers, a surprising topic given the time of the year, mid-spring now, the prospect of a dangerous toxic substance in your farm ponds, blue-green algae. It could be a threat this time of year, we're told. Gregg Hanzlicek is the director of the Production Field Investigations Unit with the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. He's regularly with us to talk bovine health management. Blue-green algae in April? You say, in fact, the laboratory has dealt with a confirmed case here in Kansas already, Greg.
We have, and that's exactly right. April, blue-green algae, that doesn't make sense. That's kind of strange because we typically deal with, as we get into the warmer months, it's a summer, early fall issue, not an early spring concern, but there's conditions that apparently caused a blue-green algae bloom, and a producer did lose some cows.
Well, back to the basic details of blue-green algae. What is it and what causes it?
Yeah, so we call it blue-green algae, but it's actually the other name is cyanobacteria. It's actually a bacteria. They're different because they're like plants. They use sunlight for energy, and they like warm temperatures. They like water that has some type of nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen. And so the times that we see the blooms in these ponds are when we have typically warmer weather. We have some type of runoff, fertilizer runoff, or those kind of things. And then a light breeze, which will blow those bacteria to one side of the pond or another and concentrate it. And then our cattle and our calves come in there and drink it. And that's when the poisonings occur.
Talk about the toxins that blue-green algae produces. Then you say there are actually 2 such toxins.
There are, and a lot of blue-green algae do not produce toxins, but there are a significant number that do, and they can produce either a neurotoxin or a liver hepatic toxin, or some can produce both, actually.
And those toxins afflict cattle how? Can be pretty serious, obviously.
Absolutely. So the neurotoxin, some people call it the fast death toxin. It basically is a rapid neurotoxin that ends up killing the animal. The hepatic or liver toxin, a lot of those animals will survive, and it attacks the liver. Some of them actually will have chronic liver issues, but the death rate in those is a little bit less than it is in the neurotoxins. If it's a neurotoxin, a lot of times you'll have some dead cows or dead calves, but there'll also be other species around the edge of the pond that are also dead, because these toxins attack just about every species. So there might have some snakes, you might have any type of rodent, you might have even some birds might be dead around the pond next to the bloom. So that's one indication that you've got a blue-green algae problem. The other one, if it's a hepatic toxin thing, some of the clinical signs we see in cattle, they'll be heavy breathing, they might have a bloody diarrhea, some of them will be convulsing. Those kind of things indicate that you might have blue-green algae, but they're not specific for blue-green algae. So it's important that if you see those signs that you call your local veterinarian and have them provide the right diagnosis for what the issue is.
And once more, the actual appearance of that blue-green algae and distinguishing it from other algae types. Very important here before one pulls the trigger prematurely on reacting to this, Gregg.
Well, that's a great point, is that if you're out in your pond and you think you might have a bloom, if you go over there and the bloom, they look like plants, meaning they've got even small leaves or stems or whatever, it's not blue-green algae. Blue-green algae blooms typically look like green or blue paint that's not been stirred up. And if you actually look closely at those blooms, those algae look more like grains of sand than they do plants. The only way to really know that is to actually do some diagnostics.
And we want to talk of how to go about that in just a second. As far as cattle health is concerned here, though, there is no treatment for these toxins if they are ingested, you say?
There really isn't any treatment. I mean, some people have tried to use activated charcoal and pump cows with activated charcoal so that it absorbs the toxins in the rumen. But basically, we just say there's really no practical, effective treatment for blue-green algae poisoning.
So that comes back to preventative measures, and we will share those as well, what is available to the producer. Having that water and that algae tested to positively identify it, there's a procedure involved here, and your laboratory has worked with that with some frequency in the past, Gregg.
We've actually provided a couple different tests, and we also have a video on KSVDL YouTube channel that'll shows producers how to take the appropriate sample from the pond for this testing or any other type of water testing. That what we recommend is that they collect about 16 ounces of water and then keep it chilled, send it to the laboratory on ice. Once it gets to the laboratory, we can look at the sample and say, yes, there's blue-green algae present. And we can also do a different test that's actually going to look for the most common blue-green algae toxin. So we can go about it in a couple ways to determine whether those cattle are at risk for poisoning.
The video on the K-State Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory website, very helpful as far as procedure for testing a farm pond for this algae, KSVDL, the YouTube channel there. If, in fact, the results come back and a producer confirms that there is a blue-green algae threat in their farm pond, what can they do? Preventative measures are somewhat limited here, you say.
They are. There's quite a few that are listed out there, but most of them aren't practical. Probably one of them that might be practical for herds that have ponds that experience blue-green algae issues every year. There are some relatively inexpensive aerators that they can put in the pond, and that just keeps the water stirred up so that the blue-green algae doesn't concentrate in one side or the other. But really, practically, if a producer notices that they've got a blue-green algae bloom at one side of the pond or one edge, basically what we recommend is that they get some cattle panels and put that around the edge of the pond and force those cows and calves to drink in areas of the pond where the bloom is not occurring. And this is a dose-related toxin, so they can go to other areas that don't have the bloom and drink, and it should be perfectly safe.
But you need to leave an adequate buffer between the good water and the bad, so to say.
Absolutely, yes. Just put those panels, or some people even actually build just kind of a temporary fence, but make sure you extend that to areas where the water looks like it has no bloom whatsoever.
And another remedy that's often proposed out there, treating that algae with copper sulfate. Talk about the pros and cons of that.
Yeah, so that's a treatment. That's considered to be a treatment. And so when there's a blue-green algae bloom, if we can actually spread copper sulfate across the surface of the entire pond, what that does, it kills the blue-green algae. Now, there's some downsides of that. Is one, there's a particular dose of copper sulfate that needs to be applied. And so there has to be a calculation on how many gallons of water or how many hectares of water there actually is in the pond. The other thing is that typically it's going to kill the fish. We're putting a high concentration of copper in there. A couple of other things is that, number one, you certainly wouldn't want sheep even close to that water. But even with your cattle, once you use that copper sulfate, the recommendation is do not let those cattle drink out of that pond for at least 5 days, because when you kill the bacteria with the copper sulfate, they're going to release toxins. And so the toxin level of that pond is going to go up. So it sounds good and it does work. And then the one thing I forgot is that if you apply it today because you have a bloom, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to take care of the whole season. The bloom may come back and you might have to apply it again. So you can do it as a treatment. It is very effective, but there's some downsides.
It's not a panacea by any means, which brings us back to the important matter at hand, that producers be aware of this potential threat, even this early, Gregg. And if they have any doubts whatsoever about whether that is a blue-green algae out there or not, they need to follow through and get that confirmed.
Absolutely. We've said this, or I've said it a million times on this program, is that if we've got dead animals in the pasture, that's not normal. And so I highly recommend that, regardless of whether it's calves or cows, that you have the local veterinarian come out and do a necropsy. They'll know what tissues, there's particular tissues to rule in or out blue-green algae and other issues. But that way a producer will know for certain what the issue was, and then there can be some preventative measures put in place.
Very well. And once more, no, it is not too early to start thinking in these terms, because, as Gregg noted, their laboratory has already received a confirmed case of blue-green algae toxicity in cattle in eastern Kansas, leading to losses. So, Gregg, many thanks as always for joining us, and in particular for this timely input on this. That's Gregg Hanzlicek from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at Kansas State University. He's along with us frequently to talk bovine health management here on Agriculture Today.
Burning prairie grass is essential for Flint Hills ranchers. Following grazing and burning best practices can ensure that the prairie remains intact while not smoking out downwind neighbors. The Kansas Flint Hills Smoke Management Plan helps guide prescribed burning on prairie land. To learn more, visit www.ksfire.org. Again, that's www.ksfire.org.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, and over to today's agricultural news headlines now, courtesy in part of DTN. And following up on our visit earlier with Katelyn McCullock about the USDA's Cattle on Feed report, Kansas feedlots with capacities of 1,000 or more head, holding 2,290,000 cattle on feed as of April the 1st. That inventory was down 4% from last year. Placements during March in Kansas feed yards totaling 345,000 head. That was down 27% from the same time in 2019. And fed cattle marketings for the month in the state, 425,000 head, up 13% from last year, again from the USDA's Cattle on Feed report this past Friday. Bipartisan coalitions of senators and House members wrote to President Trump late last week that the USDA's payment limits on the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program will limit its effectiveness for the cattle, pork, and specialty crop sectors. Senators Dianne Feinstein and Jerry Moran organized the Senate letter, which was signed by 28 senators. They said they're concerned about the $125,000 per commodity and $250,000 per individual or entity payment limits as it relates to assistance for livestock, dairy, and specialty crops. The limitation would severely restrict the program's effectiveness for many family-owned farms and ranches across the nation. It goes on to say, we strongly urge you to eliminate payment limits for livestock, dairy, and specialty crop producers before that final program detail would be announced. The letter was signed by Senate Agriculture Committee Chairman Pat Roberts, but not by Ranking Member Debbie Stabenow, who told reporters she wanted to stress every part of the farm economy being supported. Stabenow noted that the USDA had flexibility on payment limits and did not impose them on trade aid payments. She said she would want to talk to the USDA about this issue. Feinstein said in the news release that this letter was supported by the American Farm Bureau Federation, Farm Credit Council, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, the National Milk Producers Federation, and the National Pork Producers Council, among several other organizations. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue has said he had a hard time stretching the $19 billion to benefit all of agriculture. Incidentally, Representative Jimmy Panetta of California organized a bipartisan letter to the president signed by 126 House members, making the same point. Now, the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee has called on the White House to help deal with the growing crisis facing pork producers. Colin Peterson of Minnesota wrote to Vice President Pence saying that because of COVID-19, many of America's pork producers have no access to processing and have no choice but to depopulate their herds. Peterson added that the Trump administration needs to begin a robust federal response to address the dire situation, in his words. Packing plant capacity continues to erode nationally as plants remain hot spots across the country for large numbers of positive COVID-19 cases. Tyson Foods continues announcing plant closures. Pork plants in Waterloo, Iowa, and Logansport, Indiana, suspending operations along with a beef plant now in Pasco, Washington. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union cited nationally at least 13 packing plants that employ its union workers now having experienced closures, affecting 10% of beef production and 25% of pork production. That does not include packing plants with workers from other unions or from non-union plants. And the Centers for Disease Control also issued a report citing its health and safety recommendations for Smithfield Foods to reopen its Sioux Falls, South Dakota plant. The CDC cited one of the major problems in providing information to workers is that Smithfield workers at the plant speak roughly 40 different languages. And the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union said the food supply is at risk from the COVID-19 situation, reporting that over 5,000 of its members have been sick or been exposed to the virus. The union does represent 40% of all food processing workers, about 10% of beef production, and 25% of pork production affected by plant closures or slowing of facilities. The union calling for national safety standards for all food and meat packing workers and said that those workers need adequate personal protection equipment. Plus, they said that testing for these workers needs to be increased. The union said it does not want plants to shut down, but said that workers need protective equipment and adequate testing. And grocery executives at retailers such as Walmart and Costco are worried now that supplies of some meat products could run short just as demand is surging. Quoting here Jeff Lyons, the Senior Vice President of Fresh Food for Costco, "I have not seen beef sales and all protein behave this way since the Atkins diet days, when shoppers bought up meat as part of that low-carb diet. The warehouse chain is considering new suppliers to shore up its meat supplies," he said. Last week, U.S. beef production fell 24% compared with a month earlier, with pork off 20%, poultry down 10%. That's according to estimates from agricultural lender CoBank. Some meat orders are arriving incomplete as suppliers pull back on variety and major plants closed, and grocery executives said that ground beef supplies are declining. Wholesale prices are creeping up after the fall that occurred when closed dining rooms clipped restaurant demand. Will Sawyer, a CoBank economist who researches meat production, said that we haven't seen a situation in our lifetime where the industry has contracted as quickly as we have seen in this past month. On a completely different note, Kansas is once again a national leader in wind-generated renewable energy. That's according to the American Wind Energy Association's annual market report. Kansas ranks number 2 in the nation for wind energy production as a share of total electricity generation, joining Iowa as one of only 2 states with more than 40% of the state's total electricity produced by wind power in 2019. Key metrics and rankings highlight the success of Kansas' continued investment in wind energy. Again, 41%, number 2 in the nation in total energy production. The number of wind turbines in Kansas, 3,160, number 5 in the nation, and direct wind industry jobs in 2019, more than 5,000, with capital investment in wind projects at $11.4 billion. The AWEA's annual report provides an in-depth look at U.S. wind energy each year. Those are the top stories from today's agricultural news page, and we'll be back with more after this break. You're tuned into the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. The 4-H pledge is, I pledge my head to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, my health to better living, for my club, my community, my country, and my world. 4-H members and 4-H volunteers learn the pledge and use it in their daily lives. As we all continue to deal with the impact caused by the coronavirus, Southeast Area Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist Beth Hinshaw says that now is the perfect time for all of us to live by the 4-H pledge. Beth, National Volunteer Week was last week, and that is a huge part of 4-H, is just the volunteers that take part.
Yes, Jeff, and even though we celebrated it last week, I do want to just take the time to really thank all of our 4-H volunteers from across Kansas. They invest so much of their time in our program, and, you know, one of our national slogans is Inspire Kids to Do, and that is what volunteers do in so many ways, and we just really appreciate all that our 4-H volunteers do.
And I think we will find out eventually how many of those volunteers have stepped up to still continue doing what they're doing. They're doing it in a different way, none of that face-to-face contact, but I understand that a lot of the volunteers are still Zooming and still staying in contact with the youth.
Most definitely. You know, certainly this time has forced all of us to think about how to be a little more creative with making those connections, but we do have wonderful examples of how volunteers have continued to lead their clubs and lead their projects, and we know that kids miss that connection with those volunteers. Those volunteers are important to them.
They're also finding ways the youth are to stay in contact with one another, and that's also important right now because we don't want them to be any more isolated than they have to be.
No, during this time, we definitely need to work on all the ways that we can connect safely, and that's part of our, mental health, which is, kind of part of the pledge that I wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, let's run through that. You said that this is really a good time, and really it's always a good time to live by the 4-H pledge, but especially in these kind of troubling times, it's nice to rely on that 4-H pledge.
Most definitely, and I think the ideals of the pledge, like you said, they really do guide us all the time, but I just thought we would go through it. You know, when we think about pledging our head to clear thinking, you know, that means that we're going to work hard at making good decisions, planning and organizing, problem solving, using knowledge throughout your life. And I think right now we have lots of opportunities for using our head for clear thinking. You know, when you think about the continuous education that our young people are involved in. The other thing is kids, hopefully, maybe have a little more time to devote to their projects. And so, you know, taking this time to learn more about those things is really a great idea.
Opportunity to really go in depth and do just some searching on their own to find out other ways that they can learn about that project.
Most definitely. You know we have great volunteers with good knowledge, but some of that work has to happen on your own. And that's also, you know, when kids really start to delve deep into something because it's really of interest to them, we know there's a great opportunity for learning that way as well.
What about in terms of heart?
When we think about pledging our heart to greater loyalty, you know, that is really about our strong personal values, our positive self-concept, and our concern for others. And, you know, we've seen some just really wonderful examples of young people making masks for different organizations in their communities, writing letters to people maybe in nursing homes or to neighbors that they're not getting to see or don't have a lot of visitors, making phone calls. So, you know, all those ways that we can show our concern for others. And other things that we think about our heart is, you know, is how we cooperate and how we communicate. And we do have to think differently about those things right now, but those are still important things.
And that contact with others who are more isolated really is important, and it does, like you say, mean a lot to them.
Yeah, you can really brighten someone's day with a letter or a phone call. We know that we've also got kids doing artwork and sending to their local nursing homes. You know, sometimes you just have no idea what an impact something simple like that can really have.
In terms of our hands, what are we thinking along those lines?
You know, when we think about our hands to larger service, a lot of times we're thinking about volunteering and community service. We also know that through 4-H, young people are preparing for the world of work and learning useful skills. When I think about community service, right now is a good time to be planning our 48 Hours of 4-H projects for this fall. You know, we certainly hope things are going to be kind of more back to normal then. And our community service project, 48 Hours of 4-H, is something that we do every year at the end of National 4-H Week. And this year it'll be October 10th and 11th of 2020. And certainly now is a great time to be having those conversations with others in your club or others in your project group or your family. You know, how can we serve our community and what kinds of things are going to need to be done this fall that we can have a part in?
Maybe thinking a little bit outside of the box and really putting some thought into it as to what really needs to happen and what would make a bigger difference.
Exactly, and we probably have more time to think about that and plan that this year than we ever have before.
And health, we know that health right now is on everybody's mind, but also a big part of 4-H.
Yeah, most definitely. You know, in our 4-H pledge, what we say is, and my health to better living for my club, my community, my country, and my world. And so when we think about health, you know, what are those healthy lifestyle choices that we can make? It's about character, it's about ethics, stress management, disease prevention. You know, everybody is at home a lot more right now, and so it's important to think about how can we eat well, how can we get our exercise, but also on that mental health side, you know, how can we be connecting with people and doing those things that are going to promote our good mental health?
The 4-H pledge really has so many good thoughts in it. It's something that somebody should print off and frame so that they can see it every day as they're quarantined in their homes.
Yes, and, you know, that's one of the things that we've said on some of our social media recently, and that's live the 4-H pledge today. And we think the 4-H pledge is something that we can live every day to guide us, and right now it's especially good.
That's Southeast Area Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist Beth Hinshaw with a reminder to live by the 4-H pledge every day and to thank the many 4-H volunteers working with youth across the state. To learn more about 4-H or becoming a 4-H volunteer, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.